I titled this talk Denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula because that's how the goal is typically expressed in diplomatic parlance. The real objective is denuclearizing North Korea, but the United States and South Korea go along with North Korea's insistence that on saying denuclearization of the whole peninsula. During a year of engagement in 2018, including at a June 2018 summit in Singapore with US President Donald Trump, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un several times committed to working toward complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Now, working toward is a diplomatic way of saying they might never get there, actually. And most analysts assess that Kim has no intention to denuclearize because nuclear weapons are deemed key to the survival of his family, of his nation. North Korea says that the phrase denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula also means the complete removal of US nuclear threats, including US nuclear weapons they say are deployed in South Korea, and nuclear threats targeting North Korea from surrounding areas. Now, North Korea surely knows there are no US nuclear weapons in South Korea. They used to be there for over 30 years, but they were removed in 1991. But the United States does maintain a nuclear umbrella over South Korea and Japan as part of its security commitments. North Korea wants those commitments withdrawn. Before getting back to the prospects for denuclearization, I'd like to review some history. North Korea is the only country to have withdrawn from the NPT, albeit not entirely legally in the view of many. It's the only country to have joined the NPT with the obvious intention to violate it, in my assessment. And it's the only country to test nuclear weapons this century. Pyongyang's interest in nuclear weapons was motivated by 3 or 4 main factors. One is that the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, wanted an insurance policy in the event of the loss of military support from Moscow and Beijing. Seeing the crisis in Soviet-Chinese relations that began in 1956, Pyongyang no longer had the full confidence in its security treaties with China and USSR. Secondly, the DPRK wanted a capable deterrence against the United States, whose air power during the Korean War devastated the country. The North Koreans haven't forgotten statements by President Harry Truman and General Douglas MacArthur about the potential use of nuclear weapons during the war. The perception of a US nuclear threat was reinforced when tactical nuclear weapons were deployed to South Korea beginning in 1958. That deployment peaked in 1967 with nearly 1,000 nuclear warheads in South Korea. A third reason emerged in the 1970s when Pyongyang undoubtedly became aware of Seoul's interest in nuclear weapons development. Note that North Korea's own nuclear weapons program started before this, though. And the United States stopped South Korean President Park Chung-hee from getting very far with his nuclear program. Fourthly, North Korea may also see nuclear weapons as contributing to its stated goal of unifying the peninsula. The logic is that nuclear weapons would deter the United States from coming to South Korea's assistance in the event of resumed hostilities. North Korea's nuclear efforts over the years can be grouped into 5 phases. North Korea's efforts began in the 1950s under founder Kim Il-sung, aided by the Soviet Union for civil nuclear energy purposes. In the late 1950s, North Korea became keen to build a research reactor, undoubtedly influenced by the US supply of a research reactor to South Korea. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States supplied client states with civil nuclear technology and training. The United States called it Atoms for Peace. The Soviet Union trained more than 300 North Korean engineers and physicists and supplied a small research reactor and a radiochemistry laboratory. By the 1960s, what began as a civilian program took on a military purpose. With the declared aspects of the program having occasionally been static for periods of time for various reasons, while it has been static, there has been a persistent drive to obtain nuclear weapons through both the plutonium and uranium routes. During this early period, North Korea decided that plutonium would be the most expeditious path toward acquiring nuclear weapons capability because uranium enrichment was deemed too difficult. Due to US diplomacy, larger reactors to produce weapons-grade plutonium were never completed. North Korea, though, did indigenously build a small plutonium production reactor and related facilities at Yongbyon that formed the core of a nuclear weapons program. The key facility was a graphite reactor using Magnox fuel. Finished in 1986, it was a version of the United Kingdom's Calder Hall type reactors. In the West, it's usually referred to as a 5-megawatt reactor based on its presumed electrical output, although the main purpose wasn't to produce electricity, it was to produce plutonium. North Korea also developed a reprocessing facility. Although the DPRK acceded to the NPT in December 1985 under Soviet urging, it did not include a comprehensive safeguards agreement with the IAEA until 1992. IAEA inspections that year revealed discrepancies in North Korea's initial declaration about plutonium production. Subsequently, North Korea's refusal to cooperate with the IAEA and to account fully for possible plutonium production led to a crisis in 1993-94. Negotiation of the US-North Korea agreed framework in 1994 resolved the crisis. Realizing that the United States was weighing a military strike, the North Korean leadership decided to revise priorities and freeze the nuclear program. Before Kim Il-sung died in July 1994, he apparently concluded that his best bet was to try for normalization with the United States by offering a suspension of the program in exchange for US concessions. The nuclear program wasn't completed, but now it was with the backing of the former Soviet Union. Kim Il-sung's son and successor, Kim Jong-il, stopped construction of 2 large reactors that could have produced plutonium for dozens of nuclear weapons. The agreed framework also required North Korea to eventually declare the plutonium produced prior to 1992 and to ship it all out of the country. But Kim Jong-il soon broke the agreement. With the plutonium route blocked, North Korea revived efforts to develop gas centrifuge technology to produce highly enriched uranium. This effort began in the late 1990s with help from Pakistan in exchange for North Korea's Nodong ballistic missiles. After the United States in late 2002 terminated the agreed framework over this secret uranium enrichment program, North Korea resumed its production of plutonium and in early 2003 announced withdrawal from the NPT. Pyongyang tested its first atomic device in October 2006. It was a fizzle, but North Korea soon improved upon it. Following Kim Jong-il's death in late 2011 and the ascendancy of his son, Kim Jong-un, the nuclear program focused on achieving a breakthrough in the military nuclear program in terms of both weapons design and delivery systems. In spring 2012, a constitutional amendment declared the DPRK to be a nuclear weapons state. Kim Jong-un ramped up the testing schedule for both missiles and nuclear devices. He conducted 2 nuclear tests in 2016 and another in September 2017. North Korea also sought to enhance its deterrent capability by building intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of reaching the US mainland. To summarize, Over the past 5 decades, the DPRK has built a robust nuclear program that includes every stage of the nuclear fuel cycle, including plutonium reprocessing and uranium mining and enrichment. Now, testing nuclear devices does not necessarily mean that North Korea has functional deliverable nuclear weapons. But given the success demonstrated in its nuclear and missile programs, fashioning a deliverable nuclear weapon and making it small enough to fit ballistic missile nose cones is well within North Korea's technical capabilities. Making warheads sturdy enough to survive the heat and buffeting of atmospheric reentry are more difficult challenges, but again, not beyond North Korea's engineering prowess. It can likely build warheads sufficiently rugged for short and medium range missiles, but it may need more time and testing to have confidence that they can meet the more stringent durability and heat absorption requirements for intercontinental travel and hypersonic speed. In addition to assistance from Pakistani and Chinese sources, North Korea obtained centrifuge equipment and other materials from the international black market. By now, North Korea's nuclear weapons program is largely self-sufficient. Though it may have trouble producing pivot bearings and high-strength aluminum and high-grade maraging steel, it can probably make do with lower quality materials that it can produce. In November 2017, North Korea successfully tested an ICBM that can hit the entire United States. Like every other nuclear-armed state, North Korea pursued both the plutonium and uranium paths. Plutonium is produced in the 5-megawatt reactor, which has a capacity of about 6 kilograms of weapons-grade plutonium a year. That means about 1 weapon worth a year. It was closed down in 2008 when 6-party talks produced an agreement to dismantle the weapons program. With CNN filming, North Korea blew up the reactor's cooling tower. Later, a new cooling system was installed and the reactor was put back to use in 2013. North Korea has been willing to forego use of the 5-megawatt reactor because it had a more secure way of producing fissile material via spinning centrifuges to enrich uranium to weapons grade. In 2010, it showed visiting scholars from Stanford University a shiny new enrichment plant with 2,000 second-generation centrifuges. 3 years later, overhead imagery showed the roof size to have doubled in size, which probably meant the plant capacity had also doubled. If so, the plant would have a capacity to produce 60 to 80 kilograms of HEU, highly enriched uranium, a year, enough for at least 3 to 4 weapons a year. The plant was built in no more than 1.5 years, so it must have been based on a functioning centrifuge plant somewhere else in North Korea. Such a facility may have been built around 2002 when US intelligence agencies detected procurement of items related to uranium enrichment. In 2018, American researchers pointed to evidence that one such covert enrichment plant is located at a site called Kangsong in the city of Cholima, a short distance away from Pyongyang. US intelligence agencies reportedly believe there's yet another secret enrichment plant. It's never been visited by foreign experts, however, so it's not entirely clear. North Korea has conducted 6 nuclear tests to date. The first one in 2006 used plutonium. After that, North Korea was able to seal the tunnels at the Pyongyang test site to prevent egress of noble gases, which might have allowed foreign monitors to determine whether the subsequent devices were based on plutonium or highly enriched uranium. North Korea described its 4th nuclear test in January 2016 as a thermonuclear device. Given that the yield was similar to the previous 2 tests, that's doubtful. But the last test in September 2017 had a yield 10 times greater. There's no doubt to me that it was thermonuclear, employing both plutonium and highly enriched uranium. Estimates of Pyongyang's current stocks of fissile material vary greatly. Plutonium production is easier to calculate based on observed reactor operating times and reprocessing campaigns, although some variables can only be estimated. The plutonium stockpile today is between 18 and 30 kilograms. That would be enough for 4 to 7 weapons, if we assume 3 to 4 kilograms are needed per weapon. The plutonium can be stretched via composite weapons that also use HEU, like that last test. How much HEU North Korea has produced is highly uncertain. We don't know when production started, how efficient the centrifuges are, and how many are in use at how many facilities. The best guess is that HEU stockpile is roughly about 500 kilograms. Conservatively assuming 20 kilograms per weapon, this would be sufficient for about 25 warheads. Other analysts, by the way, have different figures of estimates. In spring 2018, Kim Jong-un announced that further nuclear tests and test launches of the intermediate range and intercontinental ballistic missiles were unnecessary, given that the work for mounting nuclear warheads on ballistic missiles was finished. This decision came as a surprise to analysts who had assumed that North Korea would continue testing to perfect advanced compact weapons and to increase their reliability and survivability. The 5 NPT-recognized nuclear weapon states all conducted dozens, if not hundreds, of tests in order to validate and expand upon capabilities. The United States tested over 1,000 times. Yet in both the missile and nuclear realms, North Korea has never followed the testing patterns of the more advanced states. It may instead be comparable to India and Pakistan, both of which stopped after a single testing series involving 5 to 6 tests, and in India's case, an earlier one-off explosion. The pace of North Korea's missile and nuclear tests in 2016 and 2017 made me think that the United States might conduct military action. I gave it a 50-50 chance of war. You know, when Donald Trump threatened North Korea with fire and fury, and the White House was reportedly considering a bloody nose strategy, in other words, a limited strike. I thought if they did that, North Korea would respond with full force. But after successfully completing an ICBM in November 2017 that could hit most of the United States, Kim Jong-un announced that this completed the state nuclear force. North Korea then responded positively to South Korean President Moon Jae-in's invitation to participate in the Winter Olympics. Kim's next move was to seek a meeting with the US president. On the spur of the moment, Trump surprisingly said yes, good for him. Meanwhile, Kim met with Moon and Panmunjom in April and agreed to work toward the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. There's that word again, work toward. This was followed by the June 12th Singapore summit with Kim, at which Kim repeated the vague denuclearization pledge. There was no clarity over the meaning of denuclearization, no timetable for talks, no reference to verification, and no mention of missiles. The Trump administration believed that it was Trump's threats and the economic sanctions on North Korea that caused it to extend an olive branch. And this pressure undoubtedly had an impact, but probably just as important was North Korea's judgment. It had met the goal of developing thermonuclear weapons along with ICBMs that could hit the United States. This gave them a deterrent capability and thus room to seek a deal with the United States to lessen the economic pressure as long as they didn't have to give up nuclear weapons. Now, denuclearization includes 3 Ds: definition, declaration, and dismantlement, and 1 V, verification. Denuclearization is an odd term. It's both too broad and not broad enough. I mean, it doesn't mean an end to all nuclear activity. Some civilian nuclear work could continue, I believe. It should also mean ending production of delivery vehicles and chemical weapons and biological weapons. So I think we should call it not denuclearization, but DWMDization, a phrase that it's a little bit hard to say, but I claim copyright on that phrase, DWMDization. The definition should be in writing. It really must be in writing. North Korea typically fulfills the letter of agreements, but not more. For example, in 2012, the Leap Day deal, in which North Korean negotiators said that they understood US insistence that a moratorium on long-range missile tests also included space launchers. But North Korea wouldn't agree to write it down, and within weeks they announced a space launch. The United States has always insisted on CVID, complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement. The only agreed definition of denuclearization to date was in a 1992 North-South denuclearization agreement. The two Koreas agreed that neither would test, manufacture, produce, receive, possess, store, deploy, or use nuclear weapons, nor would they possess nuclear reprocessing or uranium enrichment facilities. This agreement was a non-nuclearization agreement, not denuclearization, since they didn't have any nuclear weapons to denuclearize. It was non-nuclearization. Given the progress in North Korea's nuclear program since then, the definition would need to be much more extensive. It would need to cover 4 broad categories. Number 1, it would need to include elimination of weapons and fissile material, nuclear weapons inventory, stockpiles of plutonium, HEU, tritium, and lithium-6, and probably all low-enriched uranium as well. It would have to include destruction of production capabilities, the 5-megawatt reactor, the radiochemical laboratory that is used for reprocessing, all uranium enrichment facilities and centrifuge production facilities, other facilities associated with weapons production, with the weapons program, including the test site. But whether North Korea would have to give up all nuclear facilities is up to debate. For example, if the experimental light water reactor North Korea's building is only used for civilian purposes, it probably could be allowed. Even though it could produce plutonium for weapons, I believe the risk could be managed. The diplomacy has got to be all about risk management. Denuclearization also has to include disablement of the ballistic missile program. The engines, mortars, airframes, engine test facilities, launch pads, and the teleporter erector launchers would all have to be removed. All missiles designed to be nuclear weapons delivery systems should also be eliminated. And then there should be elimination, as I said, of any chemical weapons and biological weapons program. North Korea hasn't admitted to having any of these, but it does have chemical weapons. It used them in an assassination of Kim Jong-un's stepbrother in a Kuala Lumpur airport a few years ago. Whether it has biological weapons is less clear. North Korea would have to join the Chemical Weapons Convention. It's already a party to the Biological Weapons Convention, but that lacks verification. North Korea's moratorium on missile and nuclear tests should be defined. All ballistic missile tests, including short range, should be included. And the moratorium should extend to fissile material and missile production. The United States had been demanding under the previous administration that as a starting point in negotiations, a comprehensive inventory of the nuclear weapons program would have to be provided. North Korea won't do that because it sees it as akin to turning over a target list. So don't expect any declaration until confidence has been built and North Korea receives some benefits. When they do provide a list, anticipate that the declaration won't be complete. Nobody's are. Declarations are an iterative process. Verification must be robust, but don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. You know, the 2007 dismantlement deal fell apart over verification demands. And finally, don't expect anytime, anywhere inspections. These are usually only possible in circumstances of unconditional surrender by the target country. Now, the JCPOA set with Iran that Guakhar will be talking about set a very high standard for verification. Dismantlement steps should take place concurrent with verification. Unilateral DPRK dismantlement, such as their collapsing of tunnels at Pyongyang and steps to dismantle an rocket engine test site, without verification are really poor confidence building measures. Doing it without verification destroys forensic evidence. The experience of dismantlement in Iraq, South Africa, Libya, and Russia all offer useful lessons. One lesson is that the United States and its partners could pay North Korea for the costs of eliminating weapons and infrastructure, give them an incentive to do that. Dismantlement and verification really should be a cooperative venture. South Korea President Moon Jae-in believes that North Korea really would give up nuclear weapons. I myself am doubtful. Nuclear weapons are central to Kim's sense of regime preservation and deterrence. They're a central element of his Pyongyang line policy of simultaneous advancement of nuclear forces and the economy. The generals and engineers who devoted their careers to the nuclear program wouldn't look kindly on giving up the fruits of their labors. In the past, North Korea has agreed several times to denuclearization, only for the deals to be broken over the verification disputes and other cheating. But lesser goals are achievable. And I think the Biden administration may seek lesser goals. A continued moratorium on testing, for example. Adherence to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. A cap on fissile material production. Permanent dismantlement of the Yongbyon nuclear complex, as Kim offered in his talks with Trump. It would not stopping Yongbyon, just dismantling Yongbyon wouldn't stop HEU production elsewhere, like at those secret sites, the ones south of Pyongyang. But stopping plutonium production would inhibit improvements in North Korea's nuclear weapons program. And lastly, the United States really should probe what Kim Jong-un meant in a New Year's speech in 2019 about not making more nuclear weapons. Among other things, the United States and its partners should push North Korea to adhere to the chemical weapons adherence to a treaty. So there's a lot of things that can be done short of denuclearization, but the United States and its partners have to keep denuclearization as the goal, never stop demanding it while moving forward with what they can, where they can. And with this, I'll turn over to Guakhar to talk about Iran, which doesn't have nuclear weapons, fortunately.
Thank you, Mark. Guakhar, please.
Thank you. Not for the easy problem. First of all, good morning, everybody, and I'm really glad to be joining you. Thank you for a kind introduction, John. Once upon a time, I worked with the legendary Tony Hawkins to start the summer school, the Latin American Caribbean summer school. So it's a particularly special feeling to be joining you today, albeit virtually. So unlike Mark, I'll get a D- on Rate My Room on Twitter because I couldn't be in my office today. So sorry about the background. And to compensate for that, I'm just going to start sharing slides and talk about Iran. I'll try to fit into the allocated time. Although usually it's quite dangerous to ask me to talk about Iran. This can be an hour adventure. So why talk about Iran at all. And it's a usual case study that we tend to include in all of our courses here in Vienna as well, because I think it's a fascinating case for many reasons, and it allows us to look at many different aspects of the proliferation problem. First, Iran is a long-standing case. It's really one of those issues of kind of chronic interest and chronic suspicions about the intentions with regard to nuclear technology and whether or not a country really is only after a civilian nuclear industry, or there are other intentions hiding behind, or not even hiding very much. And it also highlights the importance of the International Atomic Energy Agency and its safeguard system, and the importance and usefulness of the strengthened safeguards in particular, because it was really the application of the strengthened safeguards during the IAEA investigation that revealed lots of information about past activities in Iran that the agency and the international community hadn't known about before. It also demonstrates the importance of a state providing cooperation to the IAEA, because only when the IAEA, only when Iran does agree to implement the additional protocol, even if it's only provisionally, only then can the agency really implement its mandate to the full and get the information that could provide assurance to the international community about the peaceful nature of nuclear activities. This case highlights the challenges of compliance and enforcing the compliance with non-proliferation obligations. All right, the IAEA finds discrepancies, poses questions, doesn't get the answers. What happens next? How can the international community actually get the state to cooperate and to comply? What happens in the confines of the non-proliferation treaty, nuclear non-proliferation treaty, and its review process? And Iran's case highlighted how difficult it is to really talk about compliance of a state that is still within the treaty and is at the table. Okay? It also, certainly through the JCPOA example, it underscores the importance of diplomacy and peaceful settlement of proliferation challenges. Years of pressure and mounting sanctions didn't yield the results that really focused good faith negotiations could bring. Also, Iran is a demonstration of the importance of relations of a particular country with the so-called great powers, now the United States in particular, but in the past also, and in the present as well, relationship with Russia and China, and how that can affect the amount of attention that is being paid to the state and the amount of cooperation different countries can offer in terms of reacting to proliferation concerns. And finally, the impact of domestic politics can be observed throughout Iran's nuclear program history, and especially its impact on the negotiating behavior, both in Iran and in other countries, and most famously in the United States in very, very, very recent past. So really, if you really want to dive into the Iran case, there's plenty there to explore and many lessons to draw about the proliferation and non-proliferation regime in general. Where did things begin? Iran's case really hit the big-time news headlines and international community's agenda in the early 2000s, but it doesn't mean that the program started then. Then we learned about covert activities going on throughout the 1990s and the 80s, but even that is not the beginning of the story of Iran's nuclear program. Things really began much, much earlier, and as Mark mentioned, during the 1950s in particular, both the United States and the Soviet Union had their peaceful nuclear cooperation programs, working with allies and supplying a lot of nuclear equipment around the world. And one of the clients of the United States in particular, and one of the early adopters was Iran, which at the time had a different system of government. It still was a monarchy. And the last Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza, was very much into all things nuclear, and so he concluded one of the earliest nuclear cooperation agreements with the United States under the Atoms for Peace program, and began establishing the foundations of Iran's nuclear program. The United States supplied Iran's first nuclear research reactor, which is operational to this day in Tehran. And as a sign of the times, you can see that the reactor operated on highly enriched uranium that was completely common for both US and Soviet Union to supply research reactors running on material enriched up to 90% of uranium-235. Iran joined the NPT fairly early, brought into force its Safeguards Agreement in 1974. And at the same time, facing the windfall revenues from the international gas crisis, the Shah also announced the expansion of Iran's nuclear program. The grand plans that he announced might sound familiar if you study some of the more recent pronouncements from Iran in terms of the plans to build up to 20 nuclear reactors, power reactors with a large capacity by the mid-1990s. To fulfill those plans, the Shah of Iran sought cooperation from a number of countries, a lot of them Western, and some of the most important partners at the time were the United States, France, and West Germany. West Germany in particular concluded an agreement to build the first nuclear power plant in Iran at Bushehr, and France was in the process of concluding agreements to build additional nuclear power plants in Ahvaz or Darkhovin. And all these sites you can still see in the more recent IAEA reports when Iran was talking about expanding again its nuclear fuel cycle, its nuclear industry, building new reactors indigenously. And so all of these facilities and sites really come up. Another facility that was established during the Shah, it's the Esfahan Nuclear Research Center, and he conceived of it as the hub of Iran's nuclear program and nuclear research, and it is today a large facility. It houses the uranium conversion plant and a number of research labs. So a lot of the foundations for what is now nuclear program in Iran, a lot of that was laid back then, including the training of scientists. The Shah sent a lot of people, a lot of students abroad to study in the West. Some of them returned, some of them stayed in the West when the revolution happened in Iran in 1978-79. So that kind of caught Western intelligence by surprise. But to cut a long story short, a cleric in exile, a very popular one, Ruhollah Khomeini, Grand Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, returned after a series of protests against the Shah's rule in Iran. And so his vision for what Iran should be prevailed, and that's how Iran became an Islamic Republic of Iran, led by an Islamic jurist or the supreme leader. And Ruhollah Khomeini served as the first supreme leader until his death in 1989, I believe. Ayatollah Khomeini was very suspicious of everything that the Shah had started, and nuclear program was among them. So one of the first things he did was to roll back the ambitious plans and projects that the Shah had put in place. The only one that Iran was prepared to continue with was the construction of the Bushehr nuclear power plant. But West Germany withdrew from the project for safety concerns and also because the war started. Iran's neighbor, Iraq, ruled at the time by Saddam Hussein, perceived an opening for itself and launched an invasion of Iran in 1980. The ironic side effect of that, I think, was that it really mobilized the Iranian population around the new government. Whoever might have had reservations about the new form of government, the new republic, that really got put aside in the mobilization and the resistance against the Iraqi invasion. So Iran was fairly successful in pushing Iraq back. And then instead of sort of accepting the settlement, they decided to push into the Iraqi territory. And that's how, finding himself rather cornered, Saddam Hussein authorized the use of chemical weapons against Iranian troops and civilian population. And so I highlight Iran-Iraq war because I think it played really a central role in the formation of the strategic thinking of the new Islamic Republic. A lot of the leadership that's still at the helm in Iran came of age during the Iran-Iraq war. Their thinking on security, their position in the region, their position vis-a-vis the great powers in the US in particular, their attitude towards the reliability of the international regime, and the self-sufficiency in terms of arms procurement, a lot of that was shaped during the Iran-Iraq war. And some of the lessons that they highlight is that we have to rely on ourselves. right? We can't really count on support of the UN Security Council or any of the great powers, even when weapons of mass destruction are used, as was the case with chemical weapons. The Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, which you also see in the news a lot, also became a centerpiece in terms of arms procurement and production in Iran because of the Iran-Iraq war. And so their role in the missile program in particular, and partly in the nuclear program, is very important. And so around this time, we learn about the return of interest in the nuclear program, and Iran tries to sort of probe around and ask for cooperation from old partners, tries to seek IAEA assistance, but is mostly turned down. And a big reason for that was that the world was very mistrustful of the new Iranian government and republic for good reasons. They early on, they broke the relationship with the United States by taking the US embassy hostage and holding it for 444 days. So that really solidified the image of Iran and the new republic in the public mind in the United States and among the leadership in the United States. And so opposition to Iran became really a bipartisan issue for several decades subsequently in the United States. They also didn't make friends with the Soviet Union, and therefore Iran found itself completely isolated during the war. And because of suspicions about their activities and their attempts to export the Shia revolution, their funding of the anti-Israeli groups, all that contributed to the suspicions in the United States in particular about what kind of motivations are behind their returning interest in nuclear activities. The one project that did go ahead, interestingly, was the cooperation with Argentina to convert the Tehran research reactor from high-enriched uranium to low-enriched uranium. That was done above ground. It was fully known and under the IAEA safeguards. But I think that's one of the earlier projects in terms of converting a research reactor from high-enriched to low-enriched uranium. In the 1990s, Iran had a bit more luck in terms of finding new suppliers. The end of the Cold War had its impact. Relations with Russia improved greatly. And both Russia and China were out and about looking for clients for their businesses and nuclear business in particular. So they had concluded cooperation agreements with China on the construction of uranium conversion plant at Isfahan and a number of research reactors or small power reactors also at Isfahan. With Russia, there was an agreement to finish the construction of the Bushehr nuclear power plant that West Germany abandoned, and cooperation on low-enriched research reactors, research on enrichment, including laser enrichment, and training of scientists and students. A lot of that cooperation got scaled back. The United States again played a role there. It was again suspicious about the possible implications of such cooperation. And for different reasons, both China and Russia agreed to scale back significantly their cooperation. That's another lesson sort of that Iran learned, that it cannot rely on suppliers.
Thomas is finished.
Can you hang out downstairs and I'll come back soon? Okay, thank you. Right, where were we? So yeah, another kind of lesson for Iran is that you can't completely rely on nuclear suppliers. That's kind of the message they got from it, or at least the message they prefer to highlight from that experience. Then fast forward to, so this is all we know. So far, international community knows so far Iran is, for all the suspicions, still kind of a state in good standing in the NPT and with the IAEA safeguards. But in early 2000s, information starts to come out that there are some covert activities taking place in Iran. US intelligence played a role in submitting that information, spreading that information, and the opposition group in exile revealed in September, I think in August 2002, that they know that there are nuclear facilities being constructed in Iran. And shortly thereafter, the head of the Iran's Atomic Energy Organization, Gholam Reza Ghazadeh, announced in Vienna that they're expanding their fuel cycle, and that would sort of include all aspects of it. That raised a lot of red flags, a lot of questions. And in February 2003, Director General of the IAEA was finally able to visit Iran and came back really shocked about the scale of the program and activities that IAEA had known about. It turned out that yes, Iran was constructing 2 enrichment facilities that it hadn't reported yet, and it was working on a heavy water production plan at another site. And so this is when Iran really hit the news with its nuclear program. This is when the current IAEA investigation began, and parts of it are still ongoing. And sort of as an attempt to lower the tensions, Iran agreed to cooperate with the IAEA and accept some of the strengthened safeguards. And if you had safeguards lecture already, an important element of that was extended reporting timelines. So Iran finally accepted the modified Code 3.1, agreeing to provide information about new nuclear facilities and activities much earlier than it had before. Some of the things that were revealed subsequently and as part of the investigation and serve as the basis for a lot of the concern that the world has had with Iran's nuclear program. Turned out that there was a whole slew of undeclared activities throughout the 80s and 90s with undeclared nuclear material. There were small-scale experiments, but still something that Iran should have reported to the IAEA. Among the bigger things was the construction of a whole laser enrichment laboratory that Iran reported to the IAEA only after completely dismantling it. And it also turned out that Iran had been in contact with an illicit procurement network led by Pakistani scientist Abdul Qadir Khan, and the materials and components that Iran procured from this network served as the basis for the enrichment program in Iran. So centrifuge enrichment program, that's like the centerpiece of nuclear program in Iran right now, that was all based on that material that they got from A.Q. Khan, and then they built on it and improved. So as you know, there are 2 main paths to a nuclear weapon, right? One is through highly enriched uranium, and the other is to use plutonium. And it seems like Iran was exploring both, but uranium enrichment to a greater extent, I think, because of the availability of information and materials. And so some of the key facilities of concern in Iran have to do with uranium enrichment, and these are the 2 facilities at Natanz. One is a pilot enrichment plant. This is where mostly research and development and testing of new centrifuges takes place. And this is where the highest level of enrichment of uranium were reached in Iran, most recently 60%, as sort of a response to the demise of the JCPOA. The big fuel enrichment plant there is of industrial scale, up to 50,000 centrifuges. Their enrichment has not exceeded 5%, which is kind of normal for a civilian program. And under the Iran deal, enrichment was limited at both of these facilities. So the idea was to limit both the amount of material Iran can produce and the level of enrichment. The Fordo fuel enrichment plant is a separate facility. It's kind of a medium capacity, which is a cause of concern because it's not small enough to be simply R&D like the small Natanz one, and it's not industrial like the big Natanz. It's kind of a good capacity to really race for material to produce for nuclear weapons if you really, really have to, if you decide to throw caution to the wind and basically go for it. There was a dispute with the IAEA, unresolved to this day, about Iran not reporting, not informing the agency in time about the construction of this facility. Another concern is that
it's starting again.
It's starting again. Do you want to turn it off? Just close the computer. Sorry about that. So another concern is that it's a facility that's kind of built into the side of the mountain, on site of some of the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps military facilities. And again, question of its true purpose, and it's very hard to destroy it. And so during the Iran deal negotiations, this was one of the sticking points. What happens with the Fordo fuel enrichment facility? And the preference of the P5+1 was to not have any enrichment there whatsoever and have it completely converted to something else, which did happen. It was converted to isotope production, but now they're enriching again because they decided to roll back implementation of the JCPOA after the US withdrawal. On the plutonium side of the equation, we have the Arak side. This is where a heavy water production plant was constructed. And this is where Iran was also found to be building a heavy water research reactor. Really large capacity for a research reactor, 40 megawatts, operating on natural uranium, so doesn't require enrichment, but the moderator is heavy water, which makes the spent fuel rich in what the weaponeers would call...
I closed the computer, it's still going on.
I really don't know what to do right now. Can you ignore it?
Well, I can hear you. I can hear from here.
Hold on. So the joys of working from home. Anyway, so the spent fuel of that reactor, if it were finished and operational, would have been rich in what the weaponeers would call good plutonium for weapons. So again, this was a very important point during the Iran deal negotiations. What happens with this reactor? It was still under construction, thankfully, so it was possible to reverse it. And the agreement was to redesign it to something that is less proliferation sensitive, that wouldn't produce spent fuel so rich in plutonium that's good for weapons. And another aspect of concern with Iran is so-called possible military dimensions. And starting as early as 2004, IEA started coming across information that Iran was not only pursuing fissile material production, right, enrichment and possibly plutonium, but also was looking at the weaponization part of how to possibly make a weapon, test some of its components. A lot of things were coming up that just really didn't fit into the picture of a purely civilian program. And so the IEA was asking questions here and there and not getting satisfactory answers. And finally, in November 2011, the IEA put all of its kind of concerns about weaponization into one annex to a report to give a more complete picture to the member states about why they're asking all these questions. And so when the P5+1 was negotiating with Iran on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran deal, they were looking primarily at limiting the various aspects of fissile material production, the ability of Iran to quickly produce enough material for a nuclear weapon. Whereas the IEA in parallel was negotiating with Iran about clarifying these questions about military dimensions and weaponization. And so the agreement that they reached is that Iran would provide answers and the IEA would report about its findings and conclusions in December 2015. So the IEA agreed to a very tight deadline, but I think part of it was fueled by the desire to kind of help with the JCPOA negotiations. And the connection between the two is that the JCPOA couldn't really fully go ahead with sanctions relief and everything until there was some kind of a conclusion from the IEA about those past activities. And the IEA did reach a conclusion of sorts in December 2015. Perhaps most important to note is that most of the weapon-related activities date back to pre-2003. It seems like in 2003, having been discovered basically with their covert activities, Iran made the decision to stop this concerted effort on the weaponization side. And if there were some activities subsequently, they were not part of this kind of well-coordinated, concerted program. Some of the negotiations that were important, I would just highlight before the JCPOA. So from the very beginning, when the crisis started in 2003, Iran, well, the EU was concerned about this escalating into military action, because at the same time you have the invasion of Iraq, again on the basis of suspicions about weapons of mass destruction. So EU quite quickly stepped in, Germany, France, and UK, together with Javier Solana. And then started negotiations on a long-term solution. What kind of assurances Iran can provide in terms of limiting its nuclear program, and what kind of assurances the EU, international community, can provide in terms of security and economic cooperation. If it sounds familiar, it's because some of that thinking went into the JCPOA eventually as well. And as part of those negotiations, Iran had agreed to implement additional protocol provisionally, and to suspend a number of the sensitive activities like enrichment and reprocessing related work. All that fell apart in 2005, 2006, after the more hardline factions in Iran took control over both the parliament and the presidency. Again, if it sounds familiar and concerning, it's because we're having a similar situation now, right? We have a conservative parliament that's very assertive on the nuclear issue, and we just had presidential elections in Iran where a hardliner won, and we'll see what kind of effect that has. In 2005, it had the effect of Iran demanding solutions and proposals from the EU right away. They weren't satisfied with what they got, so they restarted a number of activities, and this escalated eventually to be reported to the UN Security Council. And there were many years from then on until 2013 trying to restart negotiations, try to get some answers, some solutions. Mostly they were failed until a different person was elected presidency in Iran, this President Rouhani, who back in the day was chief nuclear negotiator. In the meantime, we have the Obama presidency in the United States with quite a different approach from the Bush administration, willing to negotiate. So finally, they built those channels. And also the sanctions that had been imposed in the meantime, especially thanks to the work of the Obama administration, ironically, they were really biting. They were really having an impact. And so Rouhani ran his presidential campaign on the idea of getting the sanctions relief and getting country back on track economically. So all that worked in terms of both getting the Iran and the IAEA settle the outstanding issues on weaponization, and also getting the JCPOA concluded with the key features of it being enhanced verification. So Iran agrees to implement additional protocol and eventually ratify it. It also agrees to measures going beyond the additional protocols, some additional monitoring of centrifuge parts, for example, and also agrees to a number of limitations on the fissile material production side of things, limiting the amount of material it can produce through enrichment, limiting the level to which it can enrich, limiting the how advanced the centrifuges are that it's working with, and redesigning the Iraq reactor. These are the key features of the JCPOA, and then you have sanctions relief, of course, as the motivation for Iran to implement all that, and some mechanisms established for ensuring the implementation. All that has fallen apart famously after a new president in the United States announced intent to withdraw from the JCPOA and did so in May 2018. Iran gave the EU primarily a year to figure out a way around it, around the sanctions, but it didn't work. And so in May 2019, Iran announced a set of steps that they're going to take going beyond the JCPOA provisions. And right now, we're at a state where they basically breached all the limits except the Iraq reactor conversion project that survives, that's going ahead, thankfully. And in February this year, they also ended the enhanced verification under the additional protocol. What we have in the meantime is also the complication with the IAEA, quite apart from the JCPOA. the IAEA has received information about some materials and activities that hadn't been declared before, and started asking questions and asking for access to locations to take samples. And that took a while. That took 2 years to negotiate. And finally, they were given access to some locations where there was previously undeclared activities. They found uranium particles that had been through some kind of human processing. They call it anthropogenic origin. And to this day, Iran has not provided satisfactory answers to the IAEA about what those activities were. I don't know the details of what exactly IAEA asked. That's confidential. But the latest reporting from the Director General is that they are not getting anywhere in terms of receiving answers. And so we have kind of escalation on both sides, the breach of the JCPOA limitations, inability to come back to the agreement on sort of both sides, and mounting questions from the IAEA about activities that, to be fair, seem to be dating back again to sort of 2003 time period. The current status is trying to negotiate. At least the Biden administration finally got to the point where they said they want to return to the deal. Iran had refused, however, to sit at the same table with the US. And so what we have going on in Vienna is this uncomfortable situation where there are negotiations taking place at the Grand Hotel, which the picture which you see, while the US has to stay in its hotel across the street, and then the EU kind of and Russia is shuttling back and forth. So they established some working groups, key questions being the sequence of steps, really. What actions Iran will take to return to the JCPOA limits, and in what sequence will the US lift the sanctions in return. And unfortunately, the timeline has run too long. We've had the elections, and now a lot of things are sort of up in the air now. We expected the negotiations to restart. There were some talks about maybe having an agreement again on July 15, like last time, but that doesn't seem realistic. And so that's kind of where we are hanging now, with the key questions of sequence of return to nuclear limitations versus sanctions relief unresolved. I think I ran a bit over time. There's some interruptions here, but I'll stop here and be happy to answer questions or evade questions, as it were.
Thank you so much. And so nice to see the family in the background, or to hear them. So, the joys of working from home, right? And I say that with endearment. Okay, the floor is now open, or the virtual floor, for questions or comments. So I invite you to raise your virtual hands, or type in the chat box if you don't wish to speak. Yes, Anna, please.
Thank you, John. And I want to thank both presenters today. It's been really a nice, well, not nice, but like interesting morning. I used to be optimistic about the situation in Iran, and I've been losing optimism in the last few weeks. And I was wondering, Guakhar, what do you think is the worst that can happen now? Like, how bad can this go? I feel like I believe less and less that a solution can be reached to bring the JCPOA back to life. And I wonder, what's the worst that can happen now with the current conditions? And like, what can we do about it?
Guakhar, before you respond, also, of course, Mark, you feel free also to weigh in on Iran. Don't just limit yourself to North Korea and vice versa. Guakhar, are there any other questions before I ask Guakhar and Mark to respond? At this stage, I don't see any. So Guakhar, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'm too afraid to dwell on the worst case scenarios, but what we might see is that Iran, on the one hand, gets a bit carried away with its brinkmanship. Let's say about what they demand and how far they want to go, how much they want to or not want to cooperate with the IEA. And I think the domestic politics are playing into that. So far, I think the supreme leader is committed enough to continue negotiations, but they have to act tough and etc. And so once the new president takes over, we can see what kind of changes happen maybe in the negotiating team, and that would be a big clue to how serious they are about continued negotiation. So the worst case is that it all becomes very ideological again, and sort of insisting on principles at the expense of actually looking for a pragmatic solution. And that puts under pressure both the EU and the United States domestically to react, to be tough. And so we're back to escalating sanctions. And so the worst, of course, always is the possibility of a military action, which, given the current administration in the United States, I don't believe will happen. There's certainly no appetite for that within the administration itself, and I don't think the Congress can force it. And the Congress is dysfunctional enough, thankfully, to not quite get there. But it does put pressure on everyone to act tougher and tougher. People in Iran will continue to suffer. The humanitarian impact of sanctions has been very, very serious, and it's not showing signs of letting up unless there's actual effective sanctions relief. What can we do? Whoever has the ear of Iran, just talk to them. Whoever has the ear of the United States, talk to them in terms of demonstrating more flexibility and taking perhaps some courageous steps in terms of what we can agree to. The US was the first to withdraw, first to breach its obligations, first to start imposing sanctions for no reasons of compliance on Iran's part. So I think it should be on the US to demonstrate a bit more forward action in terms of returning to sanctions relief. Iran really must answer questions of the IEA. I think that is a really not useful background to the situation. The fact that they're escalating their standoff with the IEA about past activities. I think if they smoothen that up, they increase the confidence about their good intentions, and that will help with the restoration of the JCPOA. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Mark. Do you wish to weigh in?
Well, I think Guakhar put it very well. I wrote a book a few years ago, Avoiding Worst Case Outcomes. And the worst case is that Iran misjudges the red lines in an attempt to put pressure on the United States. It gets so close to being able to quickly dash to produce the highly enriched uranium for a nuclear weapon that Israel determines that it needs to take some kind of action. And it launches a military strike. And then that's not just the worst case. The worst case is that then Iran kicks out the inspectors and then goes full-fledged effort to producing a nuclear weapon, because it hasn't been doing that. It's been engaged in a hedging strategy, but it then goes further. So the worst case, Iran gets a bomb and it's bombed in an attempt to stop it, and war breaks out. So I agree with Guakhar's suggestions for preventing that.
Thank you. Colleague from the mission of Costa Rica and New York.
Thank you, Jan, and thank you also for our speakers. Very interesting presentations. I do have two questions. The first one being to Dr. Guakhar. I wanted to listen to your comments on what shall we understand that Russia and China are thinking about the Iranian issue. Especially with the new deals that we have seen in recent days between Beijing and Tehran. We normally understand the position of Iran coming from a European or American perspective, but I would like to see if you have any further comments on that, coming from China or Russia, especially on the issue like Dr. Fitzpatrick said, like, okay, let's just do not pay any attention to the IISS, and then let's just get armed. And the other question would be to Dr. Fitzpatrick. I wanted to listen, if possible, please elaborate a little bit more on the North Korea issue specifically, about the nuclear bomb and the economy. I think that is very important, considering what we have seen in the past, for example, with some other countries having a lot of leverage, having an actual nuclear bomb. So I do appreciate your comments on that. Thank you.
There's also a question in the chat, Guakhar, by Lloyd Eugene. I'll read it. The Iranian example shows the difficulty the IEA faces in dealing with nuclear weapons construction and countries. Iran covertly engaged in such activity unbeknownst to the IEA and the international community. What can be done to reduce the possibility of such activities in the future, I guess? Okay.
Do you want me to start, or do you want Mark to start?
Sure.
On the IEA, a lot of you'll see that a lot of activities that happened in Iran covertly happened before they accepted strength and safeguards, and that's why I highlighted the role of strength and safeguards early in the presentation, because once they started implementing the modified CO 3.1, once they started implementing the additional protocol, I think then they themselves were surprised about how much the IEA could get out of them. And so I think it's the lesson that we've seen with other countries as well, that the strength and safeguards really have enhanced the IEA's ability to get a more complete picture of a country's nuclear activities. And so further promoting strength and safeguards and more universal application of the additional protocol, I think is important in this regard. And I think it's getting harder to get away with covert activities than it used to be. I think the agency learned its lessons from both the Iraq case in the 90s and some verification they conducted in North Korea and verification of South Africa's disarmament. So a lot of these lessons went into strength and safeguards, and we see that it works. The difference in the amount of assurance the IEA can provide with just comprehensive safeguards versus the additional protocol is quite stark in this regard. So support additional protocol, persuade countries to accept it more as a standard. I think that's the way. Plus, societal verification has really made leaps, and our colleagues in Monterey, using commercially available satellite imagery, open source information, are able to pinpoint, locate a lot of things that previously would not have been possible. So I think it's getting harder to conceal activities by and large. Now, reacting to that remains a problem. Enforcement in the international regimes is a problem and will continue to be, especially when you have key actors that are not on the same page about the level of threat, about the assessment, about the necessity of pressure versus negotiations. And here I think we have a bit of a difficulty with China and Russia having different views. I think in some respects, Russia has a good point when they point out, when they highlight that that the ball was in the U.S. court to return to the JCPOA because it was their withdrawal based on domestic politics, basically, not on compliance. At the same time, what bothers me is that increasingly these issues become part of the game between Russia and the United States. That didn't used to be the case as much. On US and Russia, US Soviet Union disagreed on things, but when it came to non-proliferation, they were in most cases willing to put aside other differences and really work on preventing a particular country from going all the way. And the JCPOA itself is a good example of that. But now there's more and more kind of political undertone or overt political messaging in how Russia in particular talks about the JCPOA case and reacts to the US, and that weakens the ability of the regime as a whole to respond. And I am not a China expert, so I really have difficulty reading China's motivations. They clearly don't want another country with nuclear weapons, but I think their assessment of Iranian intent is different, and they don't think Iranians are as ready to go all the way as some other countries might assess. And so China is kind of looking out for its own influence they're more concerned about establishing their influence in the region, economic and otherwise, at this moment, than with the possibility of Iran actually going all the way in terms of nuclear weapons. That's just my impression. Thank you.
Mark?
The gentleman from the Costa Rica mission asked about the relationship between economy and nuclear weapons in North Korea, and I take it the question it asks, is there a trade-off? And the theory of sanctions is that there is a trade-off, that if sanctions impose economic harm, pain, that the target country will then change its behavior and stop pursuing nuclear weapons. Well, it absolutely hasn't worked in North Korea. Didn't work much in Iran either. North Korea has a policy of Byongjin line of pursuing both the economy and nuclear weapons at the same time. And poor though they are, they've been able to do so. Their former then Pakistani Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto famously said years ago that if India acquired a nuclear weapon, Pakistan would too, even if they had to eat grass. So, if a country really is determined to get nuclear weapons, it will do so, is the answer. That's what North Korea did. And especially in circumstances when all parties are not implementing the UN sanctions very tightly. China and Russia have become lax about implementing the UN sanctions. So sanctions can be a partial tool to an answer, but obviously they're not the answer, the only answer.
Okay, thank you. Gabriela, I see you have a question. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I don't know if you can hear me well. I was wondering, we were talking about the worst case scenario. I was wondering about the situation with North Korea and the United States. I was wondering about the best case scenario. Considering that the fully dismantling of the nuclear weapons program is not a possibility, I understand that they are very two different opposite positions. And I was wondering, what is the best case scenario that negotiators can aim for in this case? Thank you.
Thank you. And then we have Ricardo, and then after that, I think we'll have to wrap up. So Ricardo, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you to both professors for their presentation today. I think it was very enlightening and very clarifying from a very technical point of view, and also understanding the political sensitivities that go through both case scenarios, both from the Iranian case and the North Korean case. My question is a little bit more like having a political reading about all of this, because for the past days we've been discussing how some other conflicts at the UN Security Council have had an effect on how the P5 actually understand and see the JCPOA and how they see the effects of the JCPOA in the Iranian case, being one of these, the Yemeni conflict, for instance, where the rhetoric was to enhance sanctions because there were parts or engines or even parts of a rocket or missile that was launched in the Yemeni conflict that had Iranian parts, or even had North Korean parts, which was something that was under scrutiny and investigation at the core of the Security Council itself. So the question that I have is, how does the JCPOA and building trust again on JCPOA can have an influence, a positive influence on the North Korean case, being both cases somehow similar in the fact that the possible agreement with North Korea could also, have the same paradigms of the JCPOA. Thank you.
Thank you. And to use the moderator's prerogative, I have a question for Mark, at the risk of asking you to look in a crystal ball, Mark, but there was a clear tendency over almost the entire Kim dynasty, as we saw it would develop, to test the United States presidencies. They, especially the nuclear testing. We saw, it was also aimed to kind of test the response of the United States. I always ask this question kind of gain whether one can expect another nuclear test. What is your view? Do you think we will see that the Biden administration is tested, pardon the pun, by another nuclear test or a serious ballistic missile test? So you could also respond to that. Thank you. Guakhar, do you want to go first? No.
Well, I mean, I could, but I think the
so
question was more about JCPOA lessons for North Korea, and I think I'll let Mark do that.
Okay, so I've had three questions. Gabriela asked the positive question. John, you asked the the pessimistic question, and Ricardo was kind of in between. So the worst case, John, is that North Korea does conduct either an ICBM test or a nuclear test or both. I think either of those is completely within the realm of the possibility, but I don't know if testing the US president is really the motivation. I think the motivation is more one of putting pressure on the United States and trying to urge the United States to make some concessions, that are more practical than the ones that Trump was willing to entertain. The fact that North Korea hasn't done that the first 6 months of the Biden administration is an encouraging development. So far, so good, fingers crossed. But I think before the end of the year, we're going to see some kind of a long-range missile test. So, Gabriela, the best and realistic possibility, I believe, is that the Biden administration engages with North Korea, as they've been trying to do. North Korea so far has been resistant. They don't want to talk to the United States, maybe because of COVID or whatever. But eventually they do, and Biden administration accepts, probes North Korea's earlier offer to dismantle the Yongbyon facilities with verification. The United States would agree that this is an important step and would make some important concessions to North Korea, allow some degree of sanctions lifting. And both sides would feel that, hey, negotiations got us something, and then they go beyond that to seek additional compromises. So a staged approach, maybe it's not laid out all at once, maybe it's a step-by-step, see what you can get, because they do have to establish trust. And to get Ricardo's question, so far, one of the lessons for North Korea is the United States can't be trusted, I'm afraid. The Trump pulling out of a done deal that Iran was abiding by, you might ask, why would North Korea strike a deal with the United States? Well, they would do it if they get some immediate benefits. And that's, I think, why Iran may do it, to get some immediate benefits before the president might change again. And then, try to build upon it. I think there are some very important lessons for the North Korean case from the JCPOA. One is the advanced verification requirements of the JCPOA going beyond the NPT. If North Korea were to come back into compliance with the NPT, those advanced verification requirements are important, as is the ban on certain activities related to nuclear weapons. There are a lot of gems in the JCPOA that can be expanded upon. But North Korea, what lessons they learned, it's hard to say. They've been re-engaging again, as you noted, with Iran's missile program. Most of it's on long-range missiles. I didn't know that they had provided parts that ended up in the Yemen missiles. That's a new thing. But I think if Iran can be persuaded to rejoin the JCPOA, then that would be obviously a positive lesson for North Korea.
Thank you. Guakhar, do you have a sort of a last thought you want to share?
Just a little bit on the, not so much Yemen directly, but the regional aspect of the situation around Iran is something that could not really be brought into the JCPOA. And that's complicated the matters, because some of the regional actors weren't happy with Iran getting a special deal and them kind of being kept on the outside of it. But at the same time, it highlights how important it is to kind of segregate the issues a bit. And Mark and I were both part of the session about possible lessons of the JCPOA for the Middle East zone. And so this is kind of the reverse. It's like, if you really can focus on just settling the nuclear, make it happen, and make that the gateway for whatever other steps you want to talk about. So unfortunately, the JCPOA wasn't implemented as it was supposed to. But if it had, it could have been the sort of the opening for addressing other issues, including regional security and Iran's role in Yemen, or Saudi role in Yemen, etc. But it was important to really focus on the nuclear in that regard and not throw everything into that kitchen sink. Thank you.